Justice delayed is justice denied, and President-elect Donald Trump has effectively run out the clock on the major legal cases he faced. As he prepares for another White House term, they are fading away. Earlier this week, special counsel Jack Smith moved to dismiss both federal criminal prosecutions against Trump. And Trump's lawyers are calling on New York Attorney General Letitia James to drop her civil fraud case against him as well. Trump owes the state of New York more than $450 million in damages after a judge in February found he was liable for manipulating his net worth to defraud banks and insurers. That judgment is currently being appealed. Joining me now, Mary McCord, Executive Director for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law and former Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. Mary, great to see you. With regard to the New York case, an attorney for Trump released a statement that read, in part, President Trump has called for our nation's partisan strife to end and for the contending factions to join forces for the greater good of the country. Mary, greater good of the country or for Donald Trump?
Well, I think particularly when we talk about that civil case brought by the New York Attorney General, who brought it really for the greater good of the people of New York, it is a bit ironic to hear talking about dismissing that case as part of the greater good for America at large. I certainly appreciate that we are in a polarized situation in the U.S. and people have different feelings about not only the civil cases against Donald Trump, but also the criminal cases against Donald Trump. But, that case, Letitia James's case, it is through the trial. It is through the judgment. There are appeals pending, and certainly Donald Trump, like any other litigant, has a right to due process and a right to take those appeals. But this is not a matter of bringing a case during a presidency that might be distracting to him during his presidency. And it's also not a case about anything that he did as part of his presidency, as part of his official acts as president. So this is very far removed from some of the other cases, including the January 6th related prosecution, which, as we know, has been dismissed by Jack Smith, but did relate, at least in part, to things, wholly in part, to things that Donald Trump did while he was in office. This is all about, a business fraud done in his private capacity. So I don't think that the argument about needing to dismiss that case for the public benefit of the public writ large really holds up.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was reading that and thinking, wait, the judge has already rendered a decision. It's like there's nothing to pull back. You're in the appeals process. That the system is going to work itself out. You mentioned Special Counsel Jack Smith's two cases and his having them dismissed. I'm just wondering. But leaving open the possibility that they could be reinstated once Trump is no longer in the White House, do you expect those charges to be reinstated when Trump leaves the office? And do you expect Trump to pardon the people still involved with those cases?
Right. So just to clear things up, there's, as you indicated, the two different cases. The January 6th related prosecution at this point had been brought only against Donald Trump, although there were unindicted co-conspirators involved. And it could be that they might still be prosecuted at some future time. With respect to Donald Trump, you're right. Jack Smith moved to have the case dismissed without prejudice. Judge Chutkan granted that motion. That means it could potentially be rebrought after Donald Trump is no longer the president, because the OLC guidance, that's the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, that was binding on Jack Smith, that required Jack Smith to move to dismiss the case, that only provides a temporary immunity while a president is a sitting president. Now, that does not mean there wouldn't be issues involving like the statute of limitations. So if a future Department of Justice, after Mr. Trump is no longer in the White House, were to rebring that case, no doubt Mr. Trump's attorneys would argue that the statute of limitations has expired. There is some legal argument, though, that when constitutionally the prosecution had to be ended, had to be dismissed while Donald Trump was president, there is a legal argument that that statute of limitation should be paused while Mr. Trump is in the presidency, and it could be rebrought later. That would be subject to litigation. Do I think that would happen? And the similar issues, I would say, also take place with respect to the Mar-a-Lago prosecution involving the mishandling of classified documents. Whether that happens or not, I think depends on many, many things. I think it does depend in some ways on Mr. Trump's conduct throughout his coming term in office, what other things might happen during this 4 years, and of course, who the next president is after this term. So I'm not in a position to really speculate on that. I can only say the door is left open. Now, you also ask about the two other co-defendants in the Mar-a-Lago case, because that case was charged against Donald Trump and Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira. That case remains pending as to them. Now, I say remains pending. The appeal remains pending. The case was dismissed by Judge Cannon on the grounds that special counsel was not appropriately appointed under the Constitution. The government appealed that decision, and what the government dismissed was the appeal as to Donald Trump only. So the appeal with respect to Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira remains. Assuming that goes to argument in the 11th Circuit, and assuming the 11th Circuit reverses, as many of us expect that it would, that case would go back to Judge Cannon, and then it would be once Donald Trump becomes the president and his own Department of Justice is instated, they certainly could then, at that point, if they wish to, move to dismiss against those co-defendants. Or, as you indicated, Donald Trump could issue pardons.
One more question for you, Mary. Trump has decried what he, as we all know, what he calls the political manipulations of the Justice Department. But listen to his former advisor, Steve Bannon, what he said earlier this week.
You're not going to hide behind your cloaks. We're coming for you, too. You are corrupt. What you allowed to happen in that D.C. courtroom and what you allowed to do to these J6 people and send these to prison, Benny Thompson, you're corrupt. Liz Cheney, you're corrupt. Preserve your documents, because we're coming after you. Damon Williams and Jack Smith, you can quit and run. Andrew Weissman, you can run wherever you're going to run. The long arm of the law is going to track you down, and you're going to be held accountable.
Mary, I don't know about you, but that sounds like retribution to me. Is what Steve Bannon is proposing there, is that even legal? And even if it isn't, can anything be done if they do move forward with those threats?
You can't bring a prosecution for a criminal offense if there is no probable cause that a criminal offense has been committed. I have seen absolutely nothing that any prosecutors have done, Jack Smith or the state prosecutors, that any members of Congress have done with respect to their participation on the House Select Committee that investigated January 6th. That would be people like Congressmember Benny Thompson and former Congressmember Liz Cheney. There's been nothing out there in the record that would suggest probable cause for any prosecution. And so I do think, first of all, Steve Bannon doesn't deal with any of that. He doesn't deal with the legal requirements, what the Constitution requires, what the law requires. But also, I think it's one thing to talk about retribution. It's a whole other thing to have the Department of Justice that is made up primarily of career men and women, attorneys, prosecutors, civil attorneys who do believe in the rule of law, who do follow the Constitution and statutory law and internal guidance. And I do think would push back and refuse to engage in sham investigations. It may be that Donald Trump has immunity from prosecution for official acts, given the Supreme Court's immunity ruling this summer, but that does not apply to the men and women of the Department of Justice. And it takes a lot of people to engage in any type of political retribution. So I do not expect that to actually be successful.